Over the years, numerous people have stopped by our church office, just cold calling at the door, asking for help. Could be that they need a tank of gas. It could be food. Most often, though, it's some sort of financial help. We've also gotten a lot of phone calls from people who live nearby in one of the hotels or maybe an apartment complex. If it's not the hotels, I'd say it's almost certain that they live in our nearby city and they're looking for help. Well, what they typically say is that if they don't get this emergency help by the end of the day, they're going to be evicted. And it's so hard to know what to do. And I'll have to admit to you, my heart can become callous. Some of the people who call or visit asking for help will say that they will definitely be visiting our church worship service for the next Sunday. Now, we do not require that they visit our worship services to get help. We tell them that, but they assure me that they will be there. Well, in my 22 years of pastoral ministry here at Faith Church, I don't believe that a single person, even the ones that we've helped, have ever come to a worship service. And again, my heart can get jaded. Well, this week, we're going to be studying Exodus chapter 23, verses 10 through 32. It's a passage I believe has some encouragement for those of us who are skeptical or even cynical in our hearts. We start off in verses 10 through 12, where God is in the middle of this big, long section of telling the people of Israel about the terms of his covenant. We typically call it the Mosaic Law. Last week we studied a whole bunch of them, and this week we're going to continue. He starts off in verses 10 through 12 giving them two laws related to the concept of Sabbath. Sabbath law is grounded in the story of God creating the universe. You can read about that in Genesis chapter 1. It says he created for 6 days, and on the seventh he rested. Well, here in Exodus chapter 23, God applies that principle of Sabbath to weeks and to years. First, he says in verses 10 and 11 that farmers will farm their fields, or they will have olive groves or vineyards. And they're to care for them and farm them and benefit from the produce of them for 6 years. But they're to allow them to go fallow in the seventh year. Now the rationale, he says in verse 11, is that people in need, in poverty, and even wild animals will benefit from those fallow fields in that seventh year. Notice God's heart. It's the principle of Sabbath that he is applying to people in need, even animals in need. Think about it. If farmers just perpetually farmed, it would certainly benefit their bottom line. But God says, don't do that. Don't perpetually farm. Make room for those in need. Trust in me and allow your fields to go fallow every seventh year. Now, how this principle worked, I don't know precisely, but I suspect it would have been something like this, that a landowner would divide their fields and vineyards and olive groves into sevenths. That would allow 1/7 to go fallow on a rotating basis every year. And that would provide consistency, not only for the farmer, but also for the people in need. I mean, we should not imagine that God's application there in verses 10 and 11 is suggesting that the poor people and wild animals would have to wait 6 years until they could benefit from the fallow field. As we saw in last week's devotional in chapters 21, 22, the beginning of chapter 23, God's heart beats for those who are in need, the marginalized, the oppressed. And so we learn about how to grow a heart like God's. So we continue in verse 12. We're going to see this again. In verse 12, then, he applies the Sabbath principle to the work week. And that's probably the most common application that most people think of. You work 6 days and you're off on the Sabbath day. Or you rest on the Sabbath day. Now we studied this back in Exodus chapter 20 when we were looking at the 10 Commandments, because commandment number 4 is honor the Sabbath. Now, I'm not going to review all of that. Instead, I'm going to point out how here in Exodus 23, verse 12, God applies the principle. God says the Sabbath rest will benefit others in addition to the person who's resting. Look at what he says there. When that person who owns the farm and the fields and so on, when that person rests, God says also their oxen, their donkeys, their servants, their foreigners who are helping in their household, they all get to rest too. That is, if the landowners, the business owners, the farmers are seeing the Sabbath principle as God sees it. If so, they'll notice that Sabbath rest is not just for them, but it's also for the people who are somehow connected to the work. And so God shows us his heart again. He shows us how he sees all that are involved. He wants all to be cared for, even the animals, the human workers for sure, because they need rest too. Humane treatment involves rest. Now notice how in these three verses, verses 10 through 12, God directs his people to be aware of those who are in need. Open their hearts means open their eyes to the people in need. See them, care for them, reach out to them. We are to see that in this world we are not alone. We're not isolated. Instead, we're connected, always connected to all sorts of people around us. When I was writing my dissertation, I included a section about who makes my running shoes. Because I can think that I just go and buy my running shoes and I go run and I do it all by myself. That is not true. There's a whole host of people, from the farmers who harvest the plants that are used to make the various materials in the soles of my shoes and in the various fibers, to the people that are making and selling and shipping, and it's a host of people. We're always connected. And so we need to open our hearts and open our eyes to soften our hearts for the people that we are connected to. Now, it might seem like God changes subjects as we continue into verse 11. But I think it's actually better to say that God makes a link between the idea of Sabbath and what is normally a really typical component of Sabbath, worship. In verses 13 through 19, God really gives the people some instructions about worship. In verse 13, he expounds on that first commandment in the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. Remember that one, have no other gods before me. Well, here in Exodus 23, verse 13, God says that the people should do everything he commands. And they shouldn't invoke or even say the name of other gods. When I read that, I thought of Jesus' great commission in Matthew 28, verses 16 through 20. There he tells his disciples that they are to make disciples, teaching them to obey everything he commanded them. Now, sometimes when we hear that word make disciples, I think we get it confused or we conflate it with evangelism. But they're different. Evangelism is when we are sharing in word and deed the story, the love of the good news of Jesus' birth, life, death, and resurrection for all people. Discipleship, however, is doing what Jesus said there in Matthew 28, 16 through 20, teaching them. It's teaching them to obey. It's teaching them to live a kind of life that is following the heart and teachings of Jesus. So there's an echo there to Exodus 23:13, where God is saying that he wants his people to obey everything he commanded them. When we are in relationship with God, we desire to follow his ways, to do what he taught us, to have a heart like his heart. God wanted Israel to be like him, to follow his ways, because that was the best possible way to live. And so, worshiping God is grounded in having an obedient heart to God. One way that God tells the people they will do this is by maintaining allegiance only to him. They're to have no other gods, make no other idols. Thus, they are not to invoke the name of other gods. We don't typically talk like that, but to invoke a name is to use the name in such a way that the invoker is kind of beseeching that God to listen to them and to act on their behalf. Invocation is prayer. We sometimes do hear that word, invocation. It's a prayer that's typically used at the beginning of a banquet or a civil ceremony, sometimes even a church service. An invocation is a prayer. It's inviting a God, or that could be uppercase God, lowercase God, to be involved, to bless the people. But God says Israel is only to invoke him, to the point where they shouldn't even allow the names of other gods to be on their lips. And then God continues his emphasis on worship by introducing 3 annual festivals that they are to make a pilgrimage for. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Harvest, and the Feast of Ingathering. Now, in these verses, he just really briefly mentions them. In other places in the Mosaic Law, he'll mention them more fully. We've already heard about the first one, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the one that commemorates the Passover. That was back in Exodus chapter 12. The second one, the Feast of Harvest, is sometimes known as the Feast of Weeks. It was held 7 weeks after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In the era of Jesus and the apostles, that Feast of Weeks is known as Pentecost. The word Pentecost refers to 50. 7 weeks is not quite 50 days, but you can see the connection there. Well, that was an expression, this Feast of Harvest or Weeks or Pentecost, was an expression of gratitude to God because it was at the time of the wheat harvest. Finally, the Feast of Ingathering is also known as the Feast of Tabernacles, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Booths, the Feast of the Booths. And it referred to the temporary shelters that the Israelites lived in when God brought them out of Egypt. So it was reenacting their sojourn in the wilderness. And it was also connected to ingathering in the time of fall, the harvest. So, 3 annual festivals. God wants his people to remember and reenact his saving power in their lives. He wants them at the same time to give offerings for his blessings in the present. And through these rituals, God wants to fill the people's hearts and minds with a grateful trust in him because he is the source of their blessing. So what we see in this is that ritual is important. Ritual helps us enact the world as it ought to be. God is saying that 3 times every year he wants his people to enter into ritual, to enact a reality that looks back on the past and present and thus shapes the future as it should be, a future of ongoing trust and gratefulness in God. In verses 18 and 19, he has some additional kind of like added specific teachings about worship. You can read those. Verses 18 does seem connected to the original Passover. If you look back in chapter 12, verses 9 through 15, you'll see that. Verse 19 is unique. It says, "Don't boil a young goat, in its mother's milk." Why? What does that matter? How would a goat or the goat's mother care or know? Well, I don't think a mother's goat would know what would be happening, but the young goat might. Could be in a pot of its mother's milk. Kind of doubt this is how they did this, but what if it was? And it's tasting its mother's milk. It would know that taste. It would be familiar with that taste. And yet there it is boiling. What God is depicting here is a scene of jaded cruelty. But you might say it's just an animal. Who cares? Clearly God cares. God wants us to nurture hearts like his that care for justice, that don't get jaded, even if it's animals. God wants us to nurture hearts that care for creation, and so we avoid callousness. I'll admit, this can be hard. When my dog is whining to go outside, and I look outside, and it's cold, and it's rainy, or I think we were just outside 30 minutes ago, or just simply I don't want to get up and take him out, I can have a very callous heart. And so, what will it take to nurture warm hearts, especially to those in need, especially when they bother you. It can be hard. Well, the law code continues in verses 20 through 32, and it kind of seems like God is changing the subject again, but again, I don't think he actually is. What he does is he refers to his power and his protection of the nation as they were moving toward the promised land of Canaan. He says he's going to send an angel to guard them. Now, I don't typically think of Israel's sojourn in the wilderness as being accompanied by angels. I think of the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of cloud by day, God's palpable presence that's with them and guiding them. But an angel? Well, remember in chapter 14, verse 19, when they were with their backs up against the wall of the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army is rushing toward them, God sent an angel to protect them. Now we read that the angel will communicate with the people, and they should listen and do what the angel says as it protects them. This is God protecting his people, and he says he will be with them the rest of the journey, and as long as they worship him, and there's that worship again, as long as they give their lives to him and nurture hearts like his heart, they have nothing to fear. He will go before them and push the enemies out of their way and give them the land. All they got to do is worship and respect him, and he will take care of the rest. Israel is to make sure they do not become enamored with foreign gods, that they don't enter into covenant with foreign people. They're to remain committed to him alone. Now this section concludes with God saying, if you do that, if you worship me with all your heart, then here's the land I will give you. And he gives them dimensions of the land. So in this section of laws, we see the theme of having hearts that are passionate to worship God, hearts that have that soft warmness to reach out to those in need of justice, to have care, to ache for those who are oppressed and marginalized. So ask God to grow that heart in your life. Ask him to help you see those on the margins. Sometimes we don't even see them. The oppressed, the suffering who need help. Ask him to open up doors for you to help them, and then do it. Go help them. My congregation, I've been so thrilled with how people have participated with Church World Service and our team of people trying to help resettle refugees, our prison worship team, as well as helping with Conestoga Valley Seeds through ESL classes. It has been so neat to see people worship and nurture hearts that are warm towards God.